The first words spoken by the veterinarian was that Bonnie was in better condition than she had feared. She was rather confident that they could help her. For those of you who have been interested in the Basset Hound history segments I've done on this podcast and or want a way to help a good rescue group, I've found a great deal for you.
If you're passionate about Basset Hounds, this podcast is for you.
This is Woebegone the Basset Hound podcast with your host Don Bullock.
Hi there and welcome to Woebegone the Basset Hound podcast. I'm your host Don Bullock. Well, I have to sort of let you in on some things that are going on around here. I almost thought this episode wasn't going to get recorded because I've been so busy with some other issues. The first thing I had was computer issues. And it wasn't the problem of my computer. My Apple computer is doing great. I have an Apple Studio Max, and it has plenty of memory and plenty of power. But something I did, and I'm still not sure what I did, caused some problems with the computer. So I've had a lot of issues. And then I started my tech channel back up. I have a channel on it's more about Apple computers and the other things that I use with my Apple computers here in my studio. And I started that back up, and I got into the middle of a series of 3 videos I was doing with that. And then that's when my computer issues started. And so I've had some problems with getting all of that up and running. And then sort of going back to those videos that I did on fraud, the episodes for this podcast that I did on fraud. Well, some of you may not know what's going on in the world, but one of the companies that shares data with other companies, in other words, they collect your data and they sell it. One of those companies was compromised recently. I got an email from a service I use to monitor my information on the internet. They told me that my information had been compromised. My email address and my passwords, some of my passwords, were on the dark web. So then I had to spend several days going through and making sure that all of that was cleaned up. And they also had my Social Security number. So I had to go to all of the agencies and freeze my credit and all the things that you need to do. But while that has nothing to do with Basset Hounds, it has a lot to do with fraud. And you might want to check into that and see if your data is out there on the dark web. It's something that I'd recommend to you because they had literally billions of records that they were able to tap into. Like I said, it goes back to those fraud episodes that I did earlier. There's just so much fraud going on the internet today. And now they have a lot of information, including Social Security numbers, your email addresses, maybe your passwords that you use. So that's another issue that I had to go through and clear up before I could get back to using my computer for other things. Then to add to all that, at the beginning of this month, Emmy started her season. Now she's on time. She has them twice a year, about 6 months apart. So she's right on schedule. But that causes some problems around here because Keikos goes wild. Keikos decides that she's his, and he makes it clear through his barking and his whining and his crying, which you can hear all through the house. It's not something that you can hide. I can't sit here and record and have him barking. In fact, one reason he's not barking right now is he's sound asleep. And Pam's sitting there on the sofa. Now she gets up and starts doing something else and leaving the sofa, and he knows that. We'll start hearing him barking in the background. So Emmy's in season, and that causes all kinds of chaos with the male in the house. So just for those of you that wanted to breed someday or are interested in showing and have both males and females in your house. That's something you need to know about. You need to understand that's what happens around here. Then on top of that, we had scheduled Emmy to have anal gland surgery. Now, you may remember back in episode 6, I talked about Buddy and the fact that he had the same issue and we had his anal glands removed. Well, we took Emmy to our vet. Our vet said, Emmy's anal glands are pretty bad. They're just not going to express themselves, and you're going to have to come in every week or two, at the very least, to have them expressed. And so you might want to have them removed. Now, our vet never tells us what to do. He always is good at suggestions. We really trust him. He says, I've done a lot of anal gland surgeries recently, and the technique has changed from what it was before. In fact, we have a real new method that's working even better, much different than it was back when we had Buddy's anal glands removed. He was very confident that he could do a very good job, and this was all before Emmy came into season. So we made sure we checked with him, is it okay to do that? And she's still in season. He said, sure, there's no problem with that at all. She'll be fine. So right now, Emmy today will go get the stitches out. So that will be over. So someone had to watch Emmy these past 2 weeks. And when Pam was doing something else, or she was out running errands, I had Emmy watching duties. So I've been very busy doing that, which is fun. I'm certainly not complaining at all. And I was also trying to keep Keikos quiet and keep him from barking. I haven't been available to come and do any recording here in my studio. And you need to know, too, that Emmy's surgery came right after we had Heidi and Keikos' surgery. Heidi had developed a mammary gland tumor, and we had to have that removed. And, of course, that cost quite a bit. And Keikos had had a tumor on his hip, on his back left hip, and we had to have that removed. So then we had the cost of those 2 surgeries plus Emmy's surgery. It's adding up. There's some information I'm going to give you near the end of this podcast episode that I think you all should listen to because it's very important, something that we learned, and we learned it from Bonnie's story. And that's one of the things that I'm going to share with you today is the beginning of the second part of Bonnie's story. But it's where we learned that Bassets can be very expensive, or having any dogs can be very expensive. So I'm going to get into Bonnie's story today about how she had an illness and how we handled that and some of the costs involved. I started Bonnie's story in episode 12. She was our first puppy out of one of our dogs and a beautiful girl. Bonnie finished her AKC championship before she was a year old, which was very unusual, especially considering all the competition at the time here in Southern California. After becoming an AKC champion, Bonnie continued winning at the shows with me showing her. If we could have gotten Heather to show Bonnie, she would have even won more, but Heather was under an exclusive contract to show a bitch that we were competing against at the shows. Remember, we had plans for Bonnie to be a big part of our foundation breeding. She, however, was still young. Pam and I had contracted with an artist to paint a portrait of Bonnie. Though we had some good photos of Bonnie, the artist wanted to take some as well. We arranged to meet her at a show after judging the Bassets. I remember Bonnie was best of breed that day, and we met with the artist afterwards. She took her photos, and we found a spot to wait for group judging. That afternoon, Bonnie placed 4th in the hound group, which is a wonderful day. In those days, it was extremely unusual for a Basset hound to place in the hound group here in Southern California. We have a large concentration of great dogs here, and many of them are shown by professional handlers. It wasn't long after that show that we thought Bonnie had developed a urinary tract infection. We took her to our veterinarian who confirmed the UTI. He administered his normal antibiotic treatment. A few days later, Bonnie became very ill. I have to admit that fortunately over the years, some of the specific events have become blurred. It's great that I can't remember all the specifics because it wasn't a really good time for us. I remember taking Bonnie to our vet. He tried to figure out what was going on but wasn't successful. Since Bonnie was very ill and he didn't have any way to monitor overnight, he arranged for us to take Bonnie to the closest emergency veterinarian office. Fortunately, the vet on duty that night was outstanding and well-trained. As promised, she stayed on top of what was happening with Bonnie. From what I recall, she had to revive Bonnie 3 times during the night. When we arrived at the office in the morning, the vet suggested that we take Bonnie to another veterinarian hospital where she could be seen by an expert on internal medicine. Soon after we arrived at the other vet's office, Bonnie was taken in for evaluation. That evaluation seemed like an eternity. As I recall, it took at least a couple of hours for them to fully evaluate what was going on with Bonnie, while I paced back and forth in the waiting room. If the floor hadn't been a concrete floor, I probably would have worn a groove in it walking back and forth. Based on Bonnie's test results, she was placed in isolation because they were afraid that she might somehow be contagious. They continued running all kinds of tests, and our bill was climbing fast. The vet seemed very baffled, but could tell us that Bonnie had total renal failure, but she had no idea why. She told us that from what she was seeing, that she felt Bonnie could be saved, but it was going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money. She was determined to save Bonnie if it was all possible. We left Bonnie with her for the evening and headed home. Fortunately, that night we didn't receive any calls. That meant that things hadn't changed. Pam and I had to go to work. Something that most people out there don't understand is that teachers just can't take time off whenever they want. We both had classrooms of students waiting for us. As soon as school was out, we headed to the veterinarian hospital in Ventura to check on Bonnie. The news wasn't good, but it was somewhat better. Yes, I realize that's a contradictory statement. The vet told us they'd still not discovered the problem, but she'd been able to stabilize Bonnie. They were still isolating Bonnie because her symptoms could be caused by leptospirosis. This is a disease caused by being infected with the Leptospira bacteria. The most common place for a dog to contact Leptospira bacteria is in stagnant or slow-moving water or along the banks of streams and rivers. Dogs are more at risk if they have cuts or scrapes and they're exposed to infected water or the urine of animals that carry the bacteria. We couldn't recall any stagnant water that Bonnie had been exposed to, and all her immunizations were up to date. They were still running tests, but they had found no signs of the bacteria, so we were starting to rule that out, which sent everything back to the beginning with an unknown cause. Pam and I again went home, leaving Bonnie in the care of the veterinary hospital staff. The next morning, Pam and I had to go to work. Fairly early that morning, my cell phone rang. Fortunately, at this time, Pam and I shared 2 classrooms of students in 2 connected classrooms. When Pam realized my phone was ringing, she took over both classrooms so that I could go outside to talk. It was the veterinarian. Since she was a graduate of the University of California at Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, she knew of their work in hemodialysis and blood purification unit for companion animals, including dogs, for cases of renal failure. She had been on the phone with both. This is a hard one, folks. I need to interject here for those of you watching the video. Obviously, I got very emotional at that point in this Bonnie story. For those of you just listening, I did have to stop the recording here. And and compose myself. And it actually wasn't until the next day that I could really come in and actually hammer out the rest of Bonnie's story. This was a very emotional experience trying to get through telling that story about Bonnie. She had been on the phone with both of their dialysis program units. There was one at UC Davis, which is near Sacramento, and one north of San Diego. She asked both units if there was a spot for Bonnie and if they wanted to take her on as a patient. Both responded that they had room for Bonnie and they thought they could help. After discussing all the particulars of what it might mean for Bonnie and some of the costs and other issues involved, I told the specialist that I'd call her back with our decision. I immediately talked things over with Pam. We discussed the issues and, of course, the costs, and we chose to take Bonnie that day to the unit near San Diego. It was closer to our home. As a result, I called the specialist back in Ventura and I told her what our decision was, and she said that she would start the process at their end. As soon as I got off the phone with her, I called the office secretary on the school phone in my classroom. I told her what was happening and asked her to request 2 half-day substitutes for Pam and I so we could get an earlier start. In our district, half-day substitutes started their assignments at 11 a.m. I have to add here that our students had been outstanding through this whole period. They seemed to understand the importance of what we were doing and responded appropriately. They were a great group of kids. As soon as our substitutes arrived, Pam and I headed towards the hospital in Ventura, which was at least 45 minutes away. When we arrived, we were given instructions on where we were going, the paperwork necessary for the dialysis unit staff, and anything else that we needed to know. The veterinarian and her assistant packed Bonnie up in a crate that we always have in the back of our van, along with an IV unit to keep her hydrated for the trip. We were off to San Diego. It was a 3 to 4 hour drive depending on traffic. I don't remember how long it took. Fortunately, we were getting started early enough to avoid some of the traffic that we would have normally going through the Los Angeles area. Pam decided to drive so that I could give her the directions. Somewhere along the way, I vaguely remember stopping at a fast food drive-thru for some food. As we approached San Clemente, I heard a sound coming from the crate behind me. Pam pulled off at the next off-ramp and I checked on Bonnie. Everything looked okay, so we got back on the freeway and continued south. Fortunately, the veterinary hospital where UC Davis had their unit set up was not all the way down in San Diego. It was just inland from Del Mar. We turned inland when we reached Del Mar and followed the directions to the hospital. As we approached, I called them as directed and told them that we were getting close. When we arrived in the parking lot, they were there to meet us. The veterinarian and her assistant both placed Bonnie on a gurney and directed us to follow them. The first words spoken by the veterinarian was that Bonnie was in better condition than she had feared. She was rather confident that they could help her. I realize this is a tough place for me to stop, but I'm trying to limit the length of these episodes better than I did before in the beginning. I'll finish off this part of Bonnie's story in episode 15. As I'm sure you can assume by now, the costs involved here were accumulating quickly. At this point, the bills from our regular vet, the emergency hospital, and the hospital with the internal specialist were already in the thousands. We were about to commit to thousands more. Today, each one of those $1,000 would be worth $1,750 due to inflation. Pam and I were elementary school teachers. While we worked in a district where teachers were on the same salary schedule, we didn't make a whole lot of money. At the time, we just placed all of those bills on our credit card and hoped for the best. We knew in the end we'd have to figure out how to pay everything off. This situation isn't unusual for dog owners. Fortunately for us, we had the confidence that we could pay everything off, and we eventually did. This whole experience, however, did teach us a lesson. After this experience, we decided to start a special bank account for future situations like this. Pam and I went to a bank other than the one that we regularly used and set up a special savings account, which Pam started placing money in every month. We decided that this money could only be used for emergency bills with our dogs that we couldn't pay through our monthly income. That was its purpose. This is something I'd suggest that all of you do. None of us ever know when one of our dogs will suddenly be injured or have a major problem like Bonnie did. We owe it to our dogs to save them whenever possible. I remember being in that hospital in Ventura with a different dog. I think Moose was having a problem, and we wanted their expertise to figure out what was going on. While we were there, another couple was also in the waiting room, eagerly awaiting for information on their dog. The veterinarian came in to talk to them. While Pam and I weren't trying to listen into their conversation, they were all talking fairly loud, and we could hear just about everything they were saying. Their dog had been diagnosed with leptospirosis that I mentioned earlier with Bonnie. According to my research, Listeria attacks the cells that line the blood vessels, which makes it harder for blood clots to normally form. The bacteria spreads throughout the body and affects organs, most notably the liver and the kidneys. Signs can range from mild to severe and sometimes become life-threatening. With correct or aggressive treatment, a dog with leptospirosis can be treated successfully 80% of the time, but their kidney function may be permanently impaired. Thus, veterinary attention for dogs must be started as soon as dogs are showing the symptoms. I vividly recall the tears and agony the couple went through when they realized that they couldn't afford the costs involved to attempt to save their dog. It was difficult to watch. Pam and I were glad we'd been in a better situation with Bonnie and relieved that we set up this special bank account to handle future issues like we had. I realize it may be difficult for you to set up such an account and commit to adding money to it regularly, but it's something we're really happy that we did back then. While most of our veterinarian bills since have been paid through our regular income, we have had to use the special account on a few occasions. We were very fortunate to have that money available and replaced it when we used it as quickly as we could. Now, I know some of you out there are going to immediately say, Don, why didn't you have insurance on your dogs? Well, if you have maybe one or two, you might be able to afford insurance, but there's a lot of policies out there to choose from. And unlike people insurance, it's not really regulated what they cover. And a lot of policies don't cover a lot of things. So if you get an insurance policy for your dog, you need to make sure you know what's covered and what's not covered. For people like us with more than one or two dogs, it's just too expensive a choice. And if you run into a situation where the insurance doesn't cover your dog, you'll wish that you had a bank account sitting there to help you out. So yes, I know insurance would be great. We would love to have insurance on our dogs. Right now we have 4, and we'll soon be getting a new one from what I understand. Right now she's in Tennessee, but she'll be out here sometime this fall, sometime between now and Thanksgiving, we think. So that'll be 5. We just can't afford insurance on that many dogs. It's just impossible. Another piece of advice that I would have specifically that would have helped this couple is making sure your dog's vaccinations are current. Now, I know some of you out there will disagree. In recent years, we've seen a lot of objections to vaccinations spread through social media. I understand that sentiment and agree that it's possible that we over-vaccinate our dogs. We need to remember that our dogs have no say in what we decide, but if we're wrong, They're the ones that pay the price. Pam and I have always trusted the vaccination schedules suggested by our veterinarians. They're the experts we trust to care for our dogs. If we don't trust them, then where are we? Again, not trying to listen to the conversation, it was very clear that the couple hadn't kept up with their dogs' vaccinations. Like many of us, they had no idea why the vaccinations were really important, nor how their dogs would ever be exposed to something like Listeria bacteria. It's also possible that the care of their dog was a financial burden. It's very sad that their faithful companion that provided them so much love and support was no longer affordable to them. This is a sad situation that could have easily been avoided. Personally, I felt very sorry for the couple, but also learned from their mistake. Both we and our vets keep close records on our vaccinations and make sure that all of our dogs don't miss one. Again, we make sure we have sufficient funds available to provide for the care of our dogs and what they need. Pam and I feel we owe it to them for all they do for us. For those of you who have been interested in the Basset Hound history segments I've done on this podcast and or want a way to help a good rescue group, I've found a great deal for you. The ABC Basset Hound Rescue, which is currently celebrating their 20th year, is offering a special issue, a 52-page booklet that was written by Randy Fredrickson, an extremely knowledgeable Basset Hound historian. The booklet contains the complete rare chapter written in 1908 by Major Godfrey Hinseltine, MBH, Master of Basset Hounds of the Walhampton Pack. This, folks, is one of the most famous Basset Hound packs of all time, and Major Hinseltine was very instrumental in the history of our breed. Compiled within it are other worthy pieces and photos that add to the contents and the words of that period. These were formative years of the Basset Hound breed. You'll finally understand how French hounds became an English breed. You do not have to be a history buff to appreciate the importance of Hinseltine's input, as his hounds were used both in pack hunting and for showing. The booklet is $10 and you can purchase it through the Slobber Shop at theslobbershop.com/basset-hound-special-issue-booklet. Or you could look at the link in the description or on our website and order it through there. While you're there at the Slobber Shop, you might want to see all the things that the Slobber Shop has to sell. It's an amazing place with some outstanding and unique Basset Hound related items. Just a warning, it might get expensive. Just remember all the proceeds from the sales from Basset Hound booklet and anything else you buy at the Slobber Shop go to Basset Rescue efforts for ABC Basset Rescue. Please remember, if you go to the Slobber Shop and buy something, tell them where you heard about them. I'd greatly appreciate it. I also have some AKC news. This is a segment I've been neglecting, so when I found the following information, I thought it needed to be mentioned here. One of the things I found is an article called "It's a New Puppy Checklist, Gear You'll Need for Your New Dog." Below this checklist, they also have a link to an article called 5 Common Questions New Puppy Owners Have. That goes along with that checklist. It's really great. I'm mentioning these here because many people do get new puppies. You might have a friend or relative or even yourself. Oftentimes, getting people off to a good start with their puppy prevents that puppy from someday ending up in rescue. Another great article published recently by the AKC is called "Is Your Dog Stubborn?" Now, this is the one I really wanted to point out. I hear and read about stubborn Basset Hounds all the time. This article will help you understand the stubbornness your dog displays and offer some excellent suggestions on how to interact with your dog. Stubbornness is often a cause for dogs to end up in rescue or for people to sort of just give up on them. And that's really too bad because bassets really aren't that stubborn. Links to these articles can be found in the description for this podcast and on our website, woebegonebassets.com. There are many additional short articles like these on the AKC's website. They have some excellent experts that write these articles. This is part of AKC's goal to help all dogs, not just pure breeds. Many of these articles can be found by going to akc.org/expert-advice. That's akc.org/expert-advice. And looking at a list of categories that the articles fall in. There's many available. My standard myth for this episode continues from the first part of Bonnie's story in episode 12. There's absolutely nothing in the AKC standard for Basset Hounds that separates males from females. In episode 12, I stated that there's no size differences or guidelines for different sizes mentioned in the current standard. There is also no differences in weight in the AKC standard. In this episode, I'd like to extend that myth to physical looks of bassets, namely the head and body. Over the years, I've seen many, actually far too many, attempts at drawings of male and female heads and bodies, as well as photos. Folks, there are no differences in the heads and bodies other than what sets them apart anatomically. In Basset Hounds, males and females look the same. Far too often, we personify animals. We place human judgments on them based on what we think is feminine or masculine. These judgments just don't fit the dogs, especially Basset Hounds, because our AKC standard doesn't mention them. If you think one looks more masculine or more feminine, you're simply placing human attributes on the dog. No judgment should be based on them. Judges and anyone else shouldn't look at a dog and say, wow, she's very feminine or he's very masculine, and judge accordingly to those thoughts. Judgment should be limited to what's written in our standard. I'm sorry that I got a little too emotional when telling Bonnie's story. Even though that happened a long time ago, bringing back those memories isn't easy. You have to remember our bassets are like children to us. Have you gone through any similar experiences with one of your bassets? Please let me know in the comments on YouTube or in an email at donbullock@woebegonebassets.com. Remember, you can also ask questions for me to answer as well as make any comment that you want about the podcast. I'd really love to hear from you. Please remember to subscribe to our channel and follow the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so that you won't miss the next chapter of Bonnie's story. In it, I'll be providing some of the information that may someday save your dog's life. A thumbs up on YouTube and a high rating wherever you listen to podcasts would be greatly appreciated. Those will help expand the podcast to more listeners. Don't forget to share the podcast with other Basset Hound lovers as well. And thank you all very much for listening.
Woebegone the Basset Hound podcast is published in visual form on YouTube the first Monday of every month. A full-length audio version of each episode is published 1 week later wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our Woebegone Bassets website for show notes including photos from every episode. You can also find links to the podcast plus information on Don and his wife Pam plus their Basset Hounds. Woebegone the Basset Hound podcast is produced, researched, and hosted by Don Bullock. The music is Do Your Ears Hang Low played by Nasrality from the Philippines. It's available royalty-free on Pixabay. Please give this podcast a thumbs up on YouTube and a high rating wherever you listen to podcasts.
Until next time, this is Don. Thank you very much for listening.